I'm pretty sure everybody knows that. The British flag is a combination of the crosses of St. George of England, St. Andrew of Scotland, and St. Patrick of Ireland. However, when England and Scotland first united, there were some other god-awful proposed flags. But under the cross's early images of St. George, never
But this changed during the Crusades.
States Genoa was the first to start using the cross, and it soon spread across Europe.
That the English sailed with the flag
In
of
order
Genoa
to gain protection, so the colors could have already been established amongst the English. However, when the Crusaders first used crosses to represent their nationality, the English had a white cross and a red field, but eventually swapped with the French Red Cross on a white field. Although it should be said that these crosses were usually worn, not flown. The cross of St. George was brought back to England, but it was used alongside the banners and crosses of other popular saints, notably St. Edmund the Martyr, who is the patron saint of England. Until the 14th century, it was Edward, a militaristic king, that made the warrior St. George the patron saint of England. He ordered the soldiers to wear the cross, founded the Order of the Garter, which had the cross, and put the cross on the royal banner. The cross continued to gain in popularity and began to represent the country, in particular within the Navy by the Tudor period. Thanks to its popularity and the use in the Order of the Garter, the cross of St. George survived the Reformation, when the worship of other Catholic saints was suppressed. As for Scotland, their patron saint had been St. Andrew pretty much since its inception. However, the true reasons behind why he was chosen are a bit of a mystery in the 11th century. However, the consensus was that St. Regillus brought the bones of St. Andrew to Scotland in the 4th century, but it was only in the late 13th century that he became a national symbol when the Guardians of Scotland used the saint on their seal. Then a century later, during the height of the 100 Years' War and the border wars with the English, the Scottish Parliament required that all soldiers wear a saltire. However, it was then worn on black. In fact, in the early days, the white saltire was flown on red and green. So it was the saltire, and not the colors that represented Scotland, blue, only began to become popular in the late 15th century. It was first used by the trades of Edinburgh and gradually became established on ships. But like with England, it was not as popular as the royal banners. So both crosses had not been established for a long time. Before the countries united under James, the 6th and the first flag of Britain was created. Wales was left out because it was technically part of the Kingdom of England. However, the cross of St. David was created long after the Union. After the disestablishment of the church in Wales, in the early 20th century, there was a push for a new cross. Yellow and gold were chosen. But the only importance I can find behind these colors is that they were the colors of David's University College. The cross of St. Patrick was added in 181 to represent the union with Ireland. But this is where it gets complicated. In 1783, the Order of St. Patrick, a British order in Ireland, was created, and the red saltire was used on the crest. From there, it found its way onto the flag in 1801. The red saltire had been used by the Irish for a couple of centuries. But whether or not it is the cross of St. Patrick is disputed. The cross was in the coat of arms of the Fitzgerald family, and William Fitzgerald was a founding member of the Order of St. Patrick. Plus, many Irish volunteered to fight for the Spanish in the 17th and 18th century, and they would use the flag of the Burgundy cross. So this became associated with Ireland. So the cross could have come from either of these sources. Contemporary Irish newspapers criticized the saltire for being Scottish and argued that the cross patee was the original cross of St. Patrick. However, there doesn't seem to be any definitive proof that any one cross represented St. Patrick the Patee, the Greek cross, or the Celtic cross were all popular contenders. And the lack of consistency with the badges people made for St. Patrick's Day sort of proves this, but it is important to note that the cross was not the most important symbol. For Ireland, this honor goes to the harp, but I'll get onto that in the video on the Irish flag. The same can be said for the crosses of England and Scotland initially. The most popular symbols for the nations were the lions, or leopards depending on how you look at it, and they are still widely used today. These were flown on royal banners throughout the medieval period, and largely represented the nations before the Union. Lions appear in a great deal of arms in the 12th century, and it's surprised that they developed in England and Scotland around the same time for England. The lions can be traced back to Geoffrey of Anjou. The founder of the House of Plantagenet used gold lines on a blue field. His son King Henry II used a rampant lion on a red background, and then his son Richard Lionheart used a couple variations of the shield before settling on the three passant. As for Scotland in the 13th century, Alexander II adopted the lion rampant as part of his Great Seal, and since then, it has largely remained unchanged. Also, most of the Welsh kingdoms bore the lions in their coat of arms and banners, but of course, today the dragon is the most popular symbol of Wales. The dragon was introduced to Britain by the Romans as a military standard. The native Celts would continue to use the dragon long after the Romans had left. and the Anglo-Saxon would also use the dragon as a battle standard. Myths surrounding the dragon developed, and stories about the English white dragon fighting the Welsh red dragon were incredibly popular for centuries. During the War of the Roses, Henry Tudor, who was Welsh, used this mythology to back his claim to the throne. He put the red dragon on his banner
and placed it over green and white, the livery colors of his household.
After the Battle of Bosworth, he would adopt the royal banner as was custom.
But green and white continued to be used by the Tudors,
And his banner remained popular in Wales, with the exception of a brief period. When Mary I used the eagle of her husband, Philip of Spain, the dragon would remain on the English coat of arms, until the Scottish replaced it with the unicorn. As for England before Henry VIII, they used an assortment of creatures on their coat of arms: greyhounds, boars, falcons, and antelope.
But there seems to be no large meaning
behind these animals,
besides the monarch's personal choice.
And the same can be said for the Scottish unicorn. However, once England and Scotland merged, the unicorn in line became the standard. And finally, Northern Ireland, where no animal represents the nation.
But the red hand of Ulster is still widely used.
This hand had been used by the powerful O'Neill family
in Ulster for centuries.
And they probably got it from the Celtic god Nuada Argetlam, whose symbol was an open hand as well.